If ever the world needed the church, it sure does need us now. And the reason I believe this is because we are living in a time when so many people are distressing and stressful. They are, frightened and frustrated. And I understand it. I was talking to a very close friend of mine just the other day who I know lives in what is described as one of those hot zones where, this thing that we're dealing with now, COVID-19, the coronavirus, is spreading like you wouldn't believe. And I called him, to check on him to see how he and his family was doing. And he was sharing with me that his wife had 2 aunts that had passed as a result of the complications that were brought on by this virus. And so I understand why people are anxious and worried and nervous about the future. Enormous amounts of money are being donated by people like Bill Gates and many others to support the efforts of the medical and, scientific experts to find some type of cure or some type of vaccine. But while the world looks for a cure, believers should be asking the question, what is God after? What does he want? And I believe that a great lesson can be learned from the situation in which David found himself in 2 Samuel chapter 24. For those of you who may not be familiar with what is going on in 2 Samuel, it is an episode in David's life when he found himself in a precarious and serious predicament with God. He had called Joab in, and Joab was his general in a very real sense. You could say that Joab was head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he called Joab in and asked Joab to go around and to take a census to number the people. Well, Joab was concerned about David's motivations for wanting to take the census. Not just him, but the other members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, those other leaders in the army there of Israel. But David, the Bible says, prevailed. And so they went out and they began to count the people. What is interesting is found in verse 9. When Joab comes back with the census count, and he tells David there were 800,000 fighting men in Israel. There were 500,000 fighting men in Judah. But then the Bible tells us that David's heart was smitten. In other words, God had begun to deal with David's conscience. Because if you notice, there is something absent there. Nowhere in the text is David directed by God to take this census. It was something that David had chosen to do on his own. When Joab tells David that there were 800,000 fighting men in Israel and 500,000 fighting men in Judah, it gives us some idea of what David's motivation was. David was trying to build up his military. The problem here is that it seems to indicate that David was starting to rely more on himself than he was relying on God. What is even more interesting is how the situation began as a whole. Listen to the impetus for this situation. The Bible says in 2 Samuel chapter 24, verse 1, that the Lord provoked David to number the people. But then when you look at the same situation, and it is told from the point of view of the writer of 1 Chronicles in chapter 21, in chapter 21 it says that Satan moved David to number the people. It tells us something about how God deals with us. One of the things that I have learned in life is that whatever is happening in the visible is always preceded by something that is happening in the invisible. The Bible seems to indicate that Satan somehow, it doesn't tell us how he did it, but Satan somehow persuaded David or seduced David into doing something that God had not told him to do. But 2 Samuel chapter 24 indicates that by his permissive will, God allowed it to happen. The question that comes to mind this morning is, if God allowed Satan to persuade David to do this, why did he allow it? What was God after? What was it that God wanted from David?